Please listen carefully.
Hello and welcome to GasGasGas. This is the best podcast for the FRCA Primary Exam. Our goal is to fill your brain with all this highly useful information. You might be in the gym right now, commuting, or ironing your scrubs. Regardless, the revision is eventually going to end. But for now, expect facts, concepts, model answers, and the odd tangent. Make sure to check out gasgasgas.uk. The show notes there's loads more detail. Make sure to like and subscribe. Anyway, buckle up, get ready for your mind to be bent into a new shape, and let's get on with the show. Hello everyone, this is James at GasGasGas. As you know, and I know, we've finally finished the opioids chapter, GasGasGas. I've decided it was a chapter in retrospect. And now we're going to move into a chapter on local anaesthetics. Now, it's going to cover today's episode, obviously an introduction, which is going to try and hit the nail on the head for how they work, some of the concepts of onset, offset, and a bit of an overview, with then episodes focusing on all the main local anaesthetic agents. We're going to go from levobupivacaine to cocaine and everything in between. There's going to be a robust episode on local anaesthetic toxicity, and that's going to go into reasonable detail. We're going to touch on local anaesthetic systemic toxicity last today, because it's just something you need to know well. But then we'll have a look at bit of a deep dive into the physiology, just for some interest and fun, and to understand its purported mechanisms in a bit more detail. That's probably going to come in an episode towards the end of the chapter, so we need to get through some of the nitty-gritty first. We can't just indulge our deep physiological joys, of which I'm sure we all have many. Putting myself in your shoes, when I first came into anaesthesia, I could name a bunch of local anaesthetic agents and understood that levobupivacaine was different to lidocaine, but that was really the extent of my knowledge. I didn't appreciate any of the nuances which dictated how the mechanism of action worked and what agents might be better in what certain situations. I certainly didn't know that there were two classes of local anaesthetics, and as I was studying for the FRCA Primary many moons ago, I came to realise that there is an expectation of having an in-depth and robust knowledge of local anaesthetic agents. This is because, A, we use them daily in practice, from being kind when we're sticking in that grey cannula to neuraxial anaesthesia in emergency caesarean sections, and wound infiltration guiding the dose the surgeons should use. I imagine if you turned around and asked a surgeon who hadn't just sat their exams how a local anaesthetic really worked and what the doses were, and they'd be like, no, ask the anaesthetist. And that means that we hold a position in the hospital whereby people look at us for robust knowledge on local anaesthetics. So you might not have much of a Scooby-Doo at the start of this chapter, but by the end of it, you are going to be singing from an extensive hymn sheet of knowledge. And then you'll just be like, 20 mils of 0.5, 40 mils of 0.25, be all right. Obvious, with the natural caveats that if they're really tiny, maybe don't give them that much. So bringing it into this episode, by the end of it, I'm hoping we will have reminded ourselves about the anatomy of a nerve, how it functions on a physiological level, nerve classification, and then exploring local anaesthetic mechanism of action, classification of those local anaesthetics, and factors that influence onset and offset, as well as dipping our toes into local anaesthetic systemic toxicity and what that really means and why you need to be on top of it if it is an emergency. If by the end of this episode you've had a listen and thought, damn, that was great, everyone should know this, then, crack on, share it with your mates. That would be great. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of how local anaesthetics work, we need to just remind ourselves about nerves. So remember, we have a central and a peripheral nervous system. We've got an autonomic nervous system, which also breaks down into your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, and a somatic nervous system, i.e. the bit that senses things. When I say things, I mean like external stimuli, and delivers motion by telling your muscles where to go and receiving data from your muscles as to where they are in space. So in the context of local anaesthetics, you could say that we're actually interested in all of those things, because local anaesthesia can influence all of those things. But we're just going to imagine a nerve that is running from your spinal cord out to a muscle, and what this nerve is made up of. So at one end, you have a cell body, and sometimes cell bodies can be a little outpouching of a nerve, and sometimes they are part of the proximal end. And in this example, we'll assume we've got a cell body at the proximal end of a nerve. That's where the nucleus is, and there are a bunch of dendrites, like little tendrils coming off that nerve, that receive data from a few different places. When I say data, I should say impulses. There is then an axon between that cell body and the site at which that nerve is going to synapse with either another nerve or, in our case, a muscle, our synaptic cleft neuromuscular junction realm. There are a number of features on that axon. This axon is the chief thing that's going to influence speed of conduction, depending on how well insulated it is. These axons are wrapped in myelin, which is like a fatty material. You call it a myelin sheath, courtesy of Schwann cells, hence schwannomas, when you get them on your little cranial nerve 8. And these Schwann cells wrap the axon. However, they don't completely encase it. There are gaps. These gaps between the insulated strips of wire are called nodes of Ranvier, or Ranvier, who knows. The final interesting point is the distal end. This is the synaptic cleft. Sometimes it's called a terminal bouton. So now we can all imagine this nerve. But now we've got to think about how does it work. So it works by saltatory conduction. Saltare means to leap. And this is because these convenient chunks of insulated nerve reduce the requirement of a continual opening of sodium channels to achieve action potentials conducted down the cell. Because it takes time to do that. If your action potential can actually hop a long gap because you achieve electronegativity across a greater bit of the cell's membrane, then you speed up conduction. And it's one of the direct influences on nerve conduction speed is how wrapped in myelin it is, as is the thickness of the axon, amongst other things. There's some cool studies with squid axons. So myelin sheaths speed up conduction through saltatory conduction, where this action potential jumps between the nodes of Ranvier. Courtesy of that insulation, you get action potentials triggering sodium channel opening at the nodes, which then achieves sufficient depolarization at that point of the nerve to facilitate conduction further down. Sometimes this cell membrane of a nerve is called a neurolemma as well, just to avoid confusion with extra words, like plasmalemma might be a fancy way to discuss a cell membrane in a common cell, although no cell's common really. So what does a nerve look like when it's minding its own business, having just discussed its action potential actions? So it has a resting state when it's just waiting for someone to come along and tell it what to do next. And they have a resting negative potential of about minus 70 millivolts. This is maintained by displacing potassium ions out of the cell, alongside keeping sodium out of the cell, the chief maintainer of intracellular electronegativity is the negatively charged elements in that cell, chiefly proteins. So what is the cutoff for triggering these sodium channels to open, letting a flood of sodium come into the cell? Remember, there's lots of sodium in your plasma, there's not much potassium. There's lots of potassium in your cells, not much in the plasma. So you get a flood of sodium into the cell that depolarizes it. It has to depolarize at a cutoff. If it was all minus 70, then your nerves would be very, very lively and very excitatory. And maybe they wouldn't get very much stuff done because they're constantly being discharged in a discoordinate manner. So the cutoff is approximately minus 55 millivolts for triggering opening of sodium channels and full depolarization of that nerve cell. When the membrane fully depolarizes, it can peak at approximately plus 40 millivolts. So I mentioned these sodium channels. These sodium channels are the thing we're mostly interested in from a local anaesthetic perspective. That's where our local anaesthetics work. And they are voltage-gated sodium channels that are keeping an eye out for this change to about minus 55 millivolts that make them open up and let sodium flood into the cell. These channels can be in an open state, a closed state, and then an inactivated state, where they are closed in an inactivated position courtesy of local anaesthetic agent. how do these nerves repolarize? Otherwise, they're just going to be sat all depolarized, plus 40 millivolts, and then you're just going to end up all floppy. Well, these sodium channels don't stay open forever. They inactivate. This leads to a cessation of sodium flow into the neuron. Sodium-potassium ATPase pumps start, well, they're probably constantly actually pumping out sodium, taking in potassium. But then you think, oh, you just told me earlier that there wasn't much potassium in a nerve cell in some regards either, because it relies mostly on electronegative proteins for its internal charge. And you're right. That's because at the same time, you're opening up potassium channels, allowing them to run down its concentration gradient. And whilst potassium has a role in maintaining electronegativity in a nerve, we shouldn't discount the role of the negatively charged proteins inside that cell. You can't pump a protein out very easily. They're quite large compared to a sodium ion. The last thing I'll say is that there's not just one type of sodium channel in a human being, because, as you can imagine, if you gave local anaesthetic, it might lurk off and cause havoc elsewhere, because it would like that sort of sodium channel, but that sodium channel was everywhere. I'm not going to say that the sodium channels are tremendously different, but it'll come about in the local anaesthetic toxicity episode that some local anaesthetic agents have a greater affinity for cardiac sodium channels than others. This is important in differentiating local anaesthetics that demonstrate early or late cardiovascular toxicity, but we'll get into that later. So now we have an understanding of the anatomy of a nerve, an approximate gist of the structure of the nervous system, and hopefully we've reminded ourselves about the basic physiology of how a nerve works, although you should definitely go away and do some reading also. But here's the money shot, what about actual local anaesthetic agents? How do they really work? Because that's why we're all here, really. So, local anaesthetic agents work by sodium channel blockade, i.e. they stop those sodium channels working. Now, they're quite interesting drugs in that it isn't just it moseys along, it binds to the outside aspect of those sodium channels in the nodes of Ranvier, because no, that would be just too darn simple. A local anaesthetic agent will only work on the internal element of that sodium channel in your nerve. Why do we care? Well, that means that the drug has to get inside the nerve first, and there's our first delay. It takes time to do that, as we know. Stuff going across membranes takes time. It has to diffuse. The other interesting element of a local anaesthetic agent is that it has a marked preference for activated sodium channels. So if a nerve is sat there doing nothing and some local anaesthetic has potted on its way through, it takes longer for the block to onset. Interesting. We call that use-dependent block. So those nerves that are firing more actively, more frequently, more busier, great grammar there, James, are more susceptible from an onset time perspective. So we all now can think of a number of things that might influence how local anaesthetics get into this nerve, because we've covered it all before. We're interested in the lipid solubility of the agent and the pKa of the agent. We'll talk about lipid solubility a little bit later, but pKa has a chief influence in onset time, and this is why lidocaine and bupivacaine have different onset times, because the fraction of unionized molecule is different in these drugs, and we'll elaborate on that later. The other important factor to consider is that only the ionized form of the local anaesthetic agent will bind to that internal element of the sodium channel. So it's not like all that drug piles across the membrane, it's all sat in the nerve unionized, ready for action. Unfortunately, the contrarion is that it needs to be the ionized element that works. Now, if we had two buckets with a plasma membrane between the two and a pH different on each side of the bucket, and we chucked some local anaesthetic in on one side, we know that it would diffuse across when its unionized form makes it over, and we don't end up with just unionized molecules on the other side of that bucket, because they're in an equilibrium. So actually some of those unionized molecules shift back into their ionized form, dependent on the pH of the solution they're in, depends on the ratio of that balance between ionized and unionized. Let's remember that pKa, the number with which we label a drug, for example a pH of 8.1 in bupivacaine, means that If we put that bupivacaine in a solution that had a pH of 8.1, then you would find yourself with a 50-50 split of ionized and unionized drug. You change that pH to 7.35 or 7.45 or say 7.4 for simplicity, then that ratio shifts and you end up with only 15% of those bupivacaine molecules in an unionized state, i.e. not very much of it floating around that can cross a membrane. However, once it's on the other side, it's probably quite a bit happier, and we're quite a bit happier that in fact most of it is then ionized. Therefore, you have a greater fraction of molecules that could be potentially active, causing your desired effect. So swings and roundabouts. That's why when you stick some bupivacaine in someone's interscalene groove, you need to tell them it's not going to be instant, because otherwise they might be thinking that you're crap at your job. So just say, it takes a while to work, don't you worry. So we've splashed through quite a lot of heavy stuff there. So just maybe take a moment to let that soak in. Have a pause, have a breather, maybe go around that roundabout. There you go, you've had a rest. However, I also just want to put it out there that if anyone is thinking, I need some Viva practice, and I fancy being famous, you won't be that famous, don't worry guys. Maybe I want to get on and do some Vivacast action with Dr. Gas. And that can be arranged. Drop me an email. We can think about time and place. We could do one, we could do several. It's up to you. Terror is a great way to learn. And if you can do it with me, then you can do it with the examiners. And it's all a bit of fun, isn't it? You know, I think if you can stomach that, you can stomach most things. And hey, Tom passed. N of 1. It must be great then, guys. Naturally, I want to take credit for all his hard work. So I'll let you mull over that. Back on with the show. So I mentioned earlier that the onset time in some ways for local anaesthetics is determined by how heavily myelinated the nerve is. And we could just say that, you know, motor nerves are more myelinated than sympathetic nerves, etc., etc. But everyone loves a classification. And this really confused me for quite some time when I was studying for the exam. It didn't really seem to go in my head very well. And I think that's because there are lots of other classifications that sound a bit like an A, a B, and a C, and therefore it is just like another thing in the brain soup that you're trying to absorb and hold in long enough to blurt it out in an exam. So we'll go over it here. So, nerve classification. It's broken down by, you could imagine fibres that conduct quickly, conduct somewhat quickly, and conduct slowly. And you could already imagine in your mind that you could sort of logically work that one out a bit, because there's no point having a sensory fibre that takes yonks to get from your toe to your head, because then you've stood on that nail and fully committed. And equally, there's no point having fibres that tell your muscles to work and throw that ball or catch that ball if it takes too long that the ball hits you in the face. But we've all noticed that if we pick up something that's hot, sometimes it takes just a few moments to realise, and those few moments can mean singeing of extremities, toes, fingers, noses, or ears versus hair straighteners. So let's break it down. So A fibres have 4 subdivisions: alpha, beta, gamma, and delta. And the alpha fibres are the fastest, and the delta fibres are the slowest in this subclassification. Alpha fibres innervate skeletal muscle and go rate fast, 70 to 120 meters per second. That is really speedy. Beta fibres do tactile sensation, i.e. touch and pressure, at about 30 to 70 meters per second. You see, there's really broad ranges as well. Now, gamma fibres, it took my head a while to get around what a gamma fibre was. A gamma motor neuron might be the label it gets, like the alpha fibres are alpha motor neuron. So gamma fibres, gamma motor neurons, innervate the muscle spindles inside your muscle. And these are spindles that provide a proprioceptive mechanism for how that muscle is positioned in space and time, length, contractility. There's loads of other stuff you're going to have to learn about muscles, which we'll eventually do in the future in a muscle physiology podcast. But gamma fibres muscle spindle, proprioceptive mechanism, 15 to 30 meters per second. So not that fast, and quite a bit slower than the actual motor, alpha motor neurons. And then delta fibers, these are the ones we test day in and day out, guys, when we are checking for cold sensation during neuraxial or regional, but classically neuraxial anesthesia. Because if you can't transmit cold, you can't transmit pain, because your delta fibers do both. And they operate at 12 to 30 meters per second. So those are A nerves, A alpha, A beta, A gamma, A delta. And they are heavily myelinated, and they are fast. B fibers. So B fibers are also myelinated, but they are less myelinated than our A fiber friends. And these run at about 3 to 14 meters per second. And if you're being neurotic, there are subdivisions for this, but you don't need to know that. You just need to know B, still myelinated, slower than A, and these are autonomic preganglionic fibers. Now you're going to say, well, preganglionic? For me too. Think of it that these are a fiber that go from the central nervous system to an effect site. So, for example, the parasympathetic cranial nerve 3 going to the ciliary ganglion, or, the otic ganglion, the pterygopalatine ganglion, the submandibular ganglion, all these little ganglions that then provide parasympathetic to the rest of the face, saliva, etc. Or the vagus nerve that's oodling its way from your noodle down to your esophagus or your stomach. That's preganglionic. Just to break this into something that makes a little bit more logical sense, parasympathetic preganglionics go from either the brain or the sacrum and go on a long journey to then a postganglionic neuron that's co-located very much near that organ, whereas sympathetic preganglionics, the preganglionics are in the CNS space almost, and they quite rapidly synapse with a postganglionic neuron, of which you will find those in your sympathetics chain of your paravertebral sympathetics. And the postganglionics of the sympathetics tend to take a longer journey to their effect site. So you can imagine that your parasympathetic nervous system is quite pleased to have B-myelinated fibers because of the length of those nerves, whereas your sympathetic nervous system might be a bit less fussed because it's quite short. And last but not least, C fibers. These are absolutely unmyelinated fibers, and they do 3 roles-ish. This is where you will find your sympathetic postganglionic nerves, i.e. those ones that have synapsed in those paravertebral sympathetic chain ganglia and then journeyed off to their effect site, heart, gut, etc., etc. They also are involved in transmission of dull pain from skin and viscera, and hot and cold sensation. This is why almost it takes you longer to realise something is hot than something is cold. And they run about 0.5 to 2 meters per second, so spectacularly slowly. And then you can think about this from a local anaesthetic perspective, that they operate in an ascending order, in that C fibers are the most influenced by local anaesthetics and A alpha fibers are the least. And that's why when you stick some bupivacaine in someone's intrathecal space, it takes a while for that cold sensation to go, but then the patient's like, I can still move my legs though. And that's because it's going to take longer to achieve that skeletal muscle lock. As a cheeky little aside, in the world of the art of anaesthesia, I have taken to checking cold sensation almost immediately, caveating to the patient, I'm expecting you to feel this. This gives you some information. One, if they already can't feel cold, then expect things to work quite quickly, and you probably need to be a little bit more vigilant. You don't want a too high block if it's all going swimmingly. But also it means that then when you come to recheck the patient's cold sensation, when you're actually expecting them to have lost it, they really believe you because they're like, wow, I could feel that. No, I can't. Amazing. Helping people feel safe and that you know exactly what's going on. We've bounced between like deep-seated science and stuff and actually the application of these things, which is the joy of anaesthesia. But now we're going to talk about the chemical structure of local anaesthetic agents and classifying them back into the scientific delights. I'm glad you're as pleased as I am. So we classify local anaesthetic agents into ester and amide local anaesthetics. Now, all local anaesthetic agents have some similarities and some differences. The similarities, they all have a lipophilic aromatic ring, aka a benzene ring. This offers up reasonably good lipid solubility for local anaesthetic agents. And you'll find that on one side of the local anaesthetic molecule. On the other side of the local anaesthetic molecule, you will find an amine group. And this is the bit that does more of the local anaesthetic side of things, i.e. getting up to mischief. And different molecules have different amine groups that offer them up slightly different onset times, etc., etc. The bit that the classification alludes to is the element that joins your lipophilic aromatic ring and your amine group. And it's this joining element where the names come from. So it can either be joined by an amide or an ester. Now, an ester, as we know from remifentanil land, means that it's actually quite susceptible to breakdown at the tissue site because we have plasma and tissue esterases, and quite a lot of them floating around. So ester local anaesthetic agents don't last as long. They're broken down at the site of action, but also in the liver, whereas amide local anaesthetic agents classically only really broken down in a distant site, i.e. the liver, and they are often N-dealkylated. By that virtue, they last longer. Now you're probably trying to think, yeah, that's great, we've got classes, but then what drugs go in what class? A big long list. The chief amides to know about: bupivacaine, levobupivacaine, which is a stereoisomer of bupivacaine, which is in an enantiomeric mix, lidocaine, ropivacaine, and prilocaine. Ester local anaesthetic agents, we're talking cocaine, emethicaine, procaine. Woo. And there's a cheeky trick if you're not sure in an exam which is that cocaine, emethicaine, and procaine all have one letter I in them, whereas bupivacaine, levobupivacaine, lidocaine, ropivacaine, and prilocaine, two I's. Therefore must be an amide. Science in action, guys. Wonderfully technical stuff. So we're going to push into a little bit more about the pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics. We mentioned earlier that pKa influences onset time. The concentration of drug at site obviously influences onset time. More drug available, more action. The lipid solubility influences onset time. And then the nature of the connective tissue around that nerve. So we know that epidurals take longer because it's got further to diffuse in. We know that spinal, when it's floating around smack bang next to that nerve, faster onset time, but also in your space there may be more or less distance for that local to travel, and the nature of that tissue might be different. In younger children, fascia generally a bit thinner, generally slightly faster onset of action of local anaesthetic around that nerve. But because kiddies have a nice speedy cardiac output, more gets mopped up from the site and broken down. So maybe faster onset, but is cleared quicker. So if we're going to dip our toe into some pharmacokinetics, there's a number of elements that influence absorption and distribution. So the vascularity of the site, the dose you give, and whether or not you introduce vasoconstricting agents to that site as well, things that are going to reduce the perfusion of your target site in order to preserve the dose of local in that site for longer. The nature of the drug's protein binding, so bupivacaine 95% protein bound, lidocaine 70% protein bound, creates more of a pool of local at the site. This is turning into the extensive episode I imagined it might end up being. So, feel free to pause and make a cup of tea, guys. Or mow the lawn whilst listening, be active, be efficient. And we're just going to touch on toxicity of local anaesthetic agents. And I'm sure your brain immediately jumps to intralipid, last, VF, bah. But also we need to think that actually if you accidentally inject your local anaesthetic inside the spinal cord, that's bad news. It is directly neurotoxic and you can cause bother. There's something called conus medullaris syndrome. That's the little tapering end of the spinal cord that, if you jab, demonstrates a distinct set of pathology. It looks a bit like cauda equina syndrome. So that's why you don't inject unless you're definitely getting some CSF dripping back or the patient goes, ow, when you inject. Reduce your odds of getting yourself in a pickle. If you're not getting CSF back, I would be hesitant to inject unless you were explicitly sure or there's some weird reason why you wouldn't expect CSF to be coming back. Maybe they're led on their side and they've had a huge lumbar drain of CSF because they've got high intracranial pressure. But these are niche things. If you're not getting CSF dripping back, I'd say you're probably not in the right place. Don't make your life hell by injecting and then not having a spinal because you've just squirted it in their paravertebral muscles. Oops, may have been there myself. Fairly sure it was an epidural. Anywho, we are interested in systemic toxicity though, because it can be lethal. Now, you're unlikely to cause it with your injection of spinal bupivacaine because your dose is quite low. The danger zone is repeated epidural top-ups in labour, for example, or someone with an erector spinae plane catheter in who's been having some extra doses, or someone puts too much of a drug down there, or when we are conducting regional anaesthetic blockade in theatre and we inadvertently cause an injection intravenously of local anaesthetic. You will get a spectrum of symptoms, early and late. Early symptoms are CNS excitatory. You get perioral tingling, tinnitus, agitation, weird taste in your mouth. And then you have a CNS depressed phase. They get drowsy, they become unconscious, seizure activity. And then from a cardiac perspective, you get a hypertension followed by a drop in myocardial contractility and subsequent arrhythmias. And these arrhythmias could be asystole, VT, VF, weird bradycardias, and then cardiac arrest. Then you can obviously presume that if you manage to anaesthetize your CNS with local anaesthetic, you're gonna become apneic. So this is a disaster, and it is an emergency, and you can't deal with it by yourself. So you're gonna do the obvious things: declare an emergency, call for help, oxygen on the patient, and get out your quick reference handbook. The QRH is your friend. Get someone who's competent in theatre to start reading out the steps, i.e. sister, because they will know exactly where the stuff is, who to send for what kit, allowing you to focus on the patient. You don't care where the intralipid is, you just want someone getting the intralipid, because you're not going to go and run and get it yourself. Intralipid is the treatment of choice, other than managing your ABCDEs and going down the ALS algorithm alongside intralipid if you have a cardiac arrhythmia. The dose is 1.5 millilitres per kilo as a bolus, and then you start an infusion at 15 millilitres per kilo per hour. But read the handbook because it'll tell you exactly what to do. The mechanism: if you put loads of fat in someone's plasma space, then you partition off that local anaesthetic that is zooming around the plasma so that it becomes inactive because it's quite happily sat in a little molecule of lipid. So folks, that was extensive, but I hope that contextualises local anaesthetics and gives you some structure to hang your study off of, and it will inform the rest of this local anaesthetic chapter of GasGasGas. So, where should you go for some reading? Check out the AAGBI guidelines on local anaesthetic systemic toxicity. Really useful. There's a bunch of great BJA articles on local anaesthetics. And Dr. Robbie Erskine of Royal Derby Hospital is a bit of a local anaesthetics boffin. He's been recently featured in the Block It Like It's Hot podcast. Great podcast series. The episode I'm thinking of is all about neuraxial blockade and local anaesthetic choice for brief blockade, i.e. prilocaine and chloroprocaine. Have a look. I'll link it in the show notes. Anywho, thanks for listening. See you next time when we're gonna do bupivacaine and levobupivacaine. Cheers, guys. Hey folks, you might have realised that this episode sounds a bit different. Well, that's because my 90-day free trial of Logic Pro has run out, and I've had to resort to other inferior technologies. Makes me come to realise that actually if you want to do a good job, you have to spend a bit of money on a podcast. I've already coughed up for hosting, a relatively decent microphone, and then now some editing software. It makes me realise why folks set up systems for donations when they do podcasts. So I might try and figure that out. I don't really know how. Anyway, I apologise if it sounds a bit squirrely. I'm trying to sort things out. Thanks for listening, guys. I hope you found it useful, but if you found it awful, do let me know. Please like and subscribe, register with whichever podcast platform you find yourself using, and leave a comment if you think I need to square something away. I just want to make sure that you guys know that every day you are getting better at this. There is a bucket of content to try and consume, and it is like drinking from a fire hose. Take it day by day, don't overcook yourself, don't freak out, and keep studying.